Ben Hodges is a retired U.S. Army Lieutenant General and former commander at the U.S. Army Europe. Welcome to our program, General Hodges.
Thank you very much, Daniel.
As the war in Ukraine nears its third year, where the war is headed right now, from your perspective?
I think that after 11 years of war and all the damage and casualties that Russia has suffered, the Black Sea Fleet is a non-factor. The Russian Air Force has failed to achieve air superiority over Ukraine, even over their own troops. Russian economy is in trouble. Ukraine is increasing its ability to destroy Russian oil and gas infrastructure. And in the reports I see from Ukrainians is that the intensity of Russian attacks seems less than what it was for weeks now. Russia's not able to eliminate the Ukrainian bridgehead inside Kursk. And this is without the U.S. or anybody else actually committing to saying we want Ukraine to win, and without putting full economic pressure on Russia. So if you ask me how it's going, of course, if you're in the infantry in a trench outside Pokrovsk, it's terrible. But if you can step back and think big picture, Ukraine is in a very strong negotiating position. Of course, for me, I wish that my government and others would say, we want Ukraine to win, and we're going to do everything necessary for Ukraine to win. That's not what's happening. So I think probably, how's it going? I think Ukraine is actually in a strong position right now.
Do you feel that the war is headed toward the end right now? Any signs of that?
I think that there were false expectations based on what President Trump said before he was president, that this is going to be done in 24 hours, and then it became 100 days, and now, who knows? I mean, there's a lot of mixed signals. I listened to your president just now here in Munich, President Zelensky, and I mean, he is, what an amazing leader he is. And I think that he knows that, as he said, this is my country, so it will be my plan, not just accepting whatever two other leaders might dictate. And I think that that's as it should be. So this negotiation process probably will go on for quite some time. I don't think it's going to end in the next 2 or 3 months, unless there's some massive breakthrough, because nobody on the planet believes that Putin would live up to any agreement. And so without some kind of force to compel him to live up to the agreement, it's unlikely. And so then finding who will provide this force, who, all those kind of things, I think will have to be taken into account.
I will also cover with you peacekeeping commissions after another topic, but I would like also to focus our attention on the recent statement from the J.D. Vance. U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance told the Wall Street Journal that the U.S. could use military means of pressure on Putin, even he did not exclude sending troops to Ukraine. What could be the U.S. military options for Ukraine in case of a ceasefire? How can the U.S. government support this mission from the air, on the ground, with boots on the ground, with money, or only with intelligence?
Well, actually, yes to all of those. I mean, and that was the good thing that the Vice President said, so that the Russians should worry that everything that we could do is on the table, everything. Now, whether or not they ever intend to actually do that, but, I thought it was a mistake when President Biden said back in 2021, no boots on the ground. That was even before the Russian large-scale invasion. Why would you say that? So while I have some questions and problems with much of how the Trump administration is approaching this, I was glad to hear the Vice President say, yes, we may do this, we may do this, we may do this. The Kremlin should worry about that. President Trump has so much more leverage over the Kremlin now than he did 4 years ago or 8 years ago. I've already talked about what bad state the Russians are in. On the other side, the United States economy, President Trump comes in with a very strong U.S. economy. The vast majority of the Congress supports Ukraine. So he's got all the congressional support. I just came from speaking to a U.S. senator, a Republican, and he said the vast majority of Congress supports Ukraine. So the president has everything he needs. You remember General Kellogg said, we, on a scale of 1 to 10, we probably are a 3 in terms of sanctions. So that means there's so much more that can be done. That's leverage. The president could say, okay, Putin, you're not negotiating in good faith, so we're going to open up the warehouse, and everything that we have that Ukraine needs, we're sending it without restrictions. So these are all things that could be done. It's not going to happen like that, but the Russians should worry that it could happen like that. Now, one of the things that I think has increasing appeal is the idea of the U.S., Poland, Romania, other countries providing some sort of air defense, at least for the western half of Ukraine, somehow to help knock down missiles that are coming in, drones. That would be more difficult than it sounds, but if hopefully somebody's actually working on that, maybe that is a possibility. They will have to do it before a peacekeeping force. I mean, that will have to be in place before any peacekeeping force might go into Ukraine. So I think there's a lot of things that could be done. Speed up the delivery. I mean, we have been, for a lot of different reasons, some of them are legitimate reasons, it's been slow. I know slower than what the military leadership wanted, the U.S. military leadership. It's been slower getting things there than what they wanted. So these are all things that we could do.
So you're confident that Trump's administration has enough power to force Putin to agree with this ceasefire plan if such measures are imposed?
I am very confident of that. Well, of course, what I don't know, this is only part of a bigger thing. I think negotiations are probably not just about a ceasefire or a line somewhere. I think it's probably connected to other things. And of course, every member of the administration always talks about China. So whatever is being worked out with regards to Ukraine, they have an eye towards China also. And the Chinese should see that we are willing to do all these things to defend our interests, sovereignty, freedom of navigation, etc. The Chinese should be worried. If they don't see us doing this, then I think they're not so impressed with what we say about the Pacific.
How much time could take these negotiations with Vladimir Putin and his team? Bloomberg reported that he was forming a professional team of negotiators and mediators. How much time would it take for Trump to force Putin to ceasefire?
Of course, that's an impossible question to answer. Anybody that says it's going to be done by a certain date, that is 100% wishing or guessing. I've seen people talk about, they want to get it done by 9 May so that you can have this big... I'm sure Putin would love nothing better than that, to have victory, and have the American president at Red Square. Oh my God. But this is people speculating about things. Any date or deadline is, at least in public, is artificial. And the Russians should believe that we're prepared to do this until we get to the point where President Zelensky says, I'm good with this. So however long that is.
And also from your perspective, these negotiations between Ukraine, Russia and the United States and the front lines, also Pete Hegseth commented on that, and he made one interesting statement that he does not rule out providing Ukraine with nuclear weapons if Trump decides to do so. What is your reaction to this interesting statement?
Yeah, I think Secretary Hegseth has come under some criticism from even Republican senators about what he said in Brussels there. So, and then the very next day, he, of course, began to walk back. So I think, I mean, let's be candid, it's still in the first weeks of a brand new administration. There's always going to be some mistakes made. I can't, it's hard to imagine any scenario where that would be approved. And keep in mind, and there will be some people in Ukraine that will remember this from when Ukraine did have nuclear weapons. This is so expensive. I mean, almost of the British defense budget, okay, which is close to like 2.5% of their GDP, 1% of their GDP is just to pay for their nuclear force, which is very small. So, in other words, almost half of the British budget, defense budget, is to maintain a modern nuclear force. So, I don't think serious people really believe that this would be helpful for Ukraine, even if this were a feasible thing. And I think the United States, no matter who, it's Republican, Democrat, Congress, nobody would see benefit for violations of the non-proliferation treaty. I think it's in our interest that Ukraine not feel that it had to do that.
And also, so you're confident that only conventional weapons would be needed for Ukraine to deter another Russia's attack in the future?
Yeah. I think whether it's capabilities that Ukraine manufactures itself or long-range weapons, air defense weapons, conventional artillery, all of these things, whatever is needed for Ukraine to win this war, that's what we should be providing without interruption.
Do you feel that Vladimir Putin now is interested in agreeing with a ceasefire deal? Do you feel that he suffers enough and enough pain is being inflicted on Putin, Kremlin, and all Russia's allies to agree with ceasefire deals this year?
Well, of course, he doesn't care about how many soldiers of his that are killed or damage that's done. I think he continues this war as long as he thinks that we will quit. I don't see him saying, "Oh, we've 1 million casualties," which will happen in a couple of months. They'll hit 1 million, maybe even sooner. I don't think he'll say, "Oh, that's too many. We got to stop." His survival depends on being at war and at least giving the illusion somehow that Russia is winning or going to win. So his survival is tied to that. So I have believed for the last couple of years that his only hope was to wait and hope that the U.S. would turn its back, try to get some kind of deal, and then be done. And I think when the day he realizes that's not going to happen is the day he begins trying to figure out how does he extract himself.
Do you feel that there is any kind of feeling of regret in Kremlin regarding this whole military disaster in Ukraine right now?
Yeah, of course, I can only speculate based on what different people in Russia say, the talking heads, the propagandists, the different people that talk on Russian talk shows. You've got people over here saying we should have used a nuclear weapon, we should have killed these guys, and then over here it's like, what a huge mistake. And it does feel a little bit more and more that people are coming out saying that this was a mistake, and they're feeling brave enough to be able to say that publicly. I think that says something. But in terms of serious government figures saying this was a mistake, I don't think we'll hear that.
And can you imagine a feeling of regret in Putin's head?
Well, dictators don't have a retirement plan. I mean, they stay in power for life, because usually bad things happen to dictators when they try to step down unless they have a really clear, strong succession program. I don't know who that is in Russia. So the regret probably comes from oligarchs who no longer have their flat in London, or have their kids going to school in Switzerland, or their yacht has been impounded down in Naples, or wherever. They probably have personal regret about their own life, but I don't know how many of them would actually say we should have stopped Putin. This was a terrible idea. All this destruction. We lost our Ukrainian friends, and I don't get that feeling.
If there is a ceasefire deal between Ukraine and Russia with, for example, European troops on the ground, how long could last this deal? From your perspective, there are also discussions that Vladimir Putin could use this time to regroup and attack Ukraine again. How long could last this deal with European peacekeeping forces on the ground, and also American security assistance for Ukraine, providing weapons and all this stuff?
Well, of course, that will depend on the makeup, with the mission, and who provides it. What's the expectation? I remember in 1995 when the NATO created the I-4 implementation force to implement the Dayton Peace Accord. And, somebody had said this will last for 1 year. And so the question immediately became, so then what happens after 1 year? And the Supreme Allied Commander at the time, General Jowan, was smart enough to say, I don't worry about what happens in a year. I worry about what happens now. That's what I'm focused on, which was the correct thing for the commander to say. Let political leaders argue about what happens next. And I think the I-4 did last 2 years, and then it became S-4, Stabilization Force, and it went on. And actually, that was a very successful intervention. And but it started with a very strong, capable military force, 3 divisions, a corps headquarters, air, land capabilities, everything, and rules of engagement that allowed soldiers of I-4 to use force against any Serb or Bosniak or Croatian that violated the agreement. So whatever the peacekeeping force ends up being, and whoever's in it, it has to have a very clear mission. When somebody says it's going to take 200,000 or 100,000 or 50,000, I say, well, what do you base that on? I mean, we don't even know what the mission is yet. So the size will depend on the task. If it's a zone of separation from the northern border of Ukraine to the Black Sea, that would have to be 40 kilometers, 50 kilometers wide perhaps, that's a lot of people. Now you're talking 200,000. That would be very difficult to have that much force for an indefinite period of time. If it's a smaller reaction force, obviously that's less, but that's also more easily pushed by the Russians. And the Russians on day one, I'm confident, will test immediately, are we really prepared to do whatever's necessary?
And also there are discussions about this peacekeeping missions. So from your perspective, what should be the mandate? So the main point here is that such troops should be able to fight back in case of Russia's attack.
They have to.
Do you agree with it?
Yeah, the rules of engagement. This was one of the reasons that the I-4 was so successful, was because the Serbs knew that any I-4 soldier could shoot to kill if they were pushed by a Serbian soldier. I mean, very clear, strong rules of engagement. And it has to be like a warfighting force, not 10,000 people with blue helmets. That's not going to work.
And also, my last question for you about this peacekeeping forces and this mission. What do you expect, for example, another full-scale war in the future after this cease? Are there risks for such another conflict in Ukraine after this?
Of course. If the Kremlin perceives that Europe, Canada, and the U.S. are like, oh, all right, we got a deal, get back to business as usual, U.S. focus on the Pacific, we reduce U.S. capabilities in Europe, people start wanting to buy gas from Russia again. If they see that there's a quick effort to return to business as usual, which means the urgency needed for European countries to grow their own capability, if they see that, then I think, yes, we will see a resumption of the conflict. So the key to whatever the agreed settlement is will be the Russians seeing that we are prepared, that we're not going to waste this time, that Ukrainians are going to be trying to fix all the problems, reorganize, train, get ready, make itself indigestible. Russia should see Europe pushing more and more and more into Ukraine, and at the same time growing its own capability so that it becomes, it has the real deterrent capability. That's what the Russians should see. If they don't see that, and if they don't see a strong U.S. commitment, then I think absolutely the risk goes up. In Germany, there's a lot of talk about we have to be ready for 2029. I mean, that was an estimate, like 4 or 5 years to be ready to achieve where they think they can be. All right. Well, if that's true, then the Russians will say, all right, well, why would we wait until 2029? So the danger time is between now and when Germany and other European countries think they will be finally ready.
Thank you, General Hodges, for your time and for your support for Ukraine, and glory to Ukraine.
Heroam Slava.
Thank you very much. Bill Browder is Vladimir Putin's #1 foreign enemy and CEO of the Hermitage Capital Management. Welcome to our program, Mr. Browder.
Great to be here.
I would like to begin with the recent developments. U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance said that the U.S. could impose military actions against Russia if Vladimir Putin doesn't settle the war. What is your take on such developments and the statements from the Trump administration, threats to Vladimir Putin?
Well, there is I would call it a mixed bag. On one hand, there have been some helpful, tough statements from the Trump administration. As you mentioned, J.D. Vance's discussion of troops on the ground or more sanctions. We also have President Trump issuing a Truth Social posting where he talked about taxes, tariffs, and sanctions if Putin didn't negotiate. That's one side. Then on the other side, we have President Trump having a 1.5-hour telephone conversation with Putin to discuss the supposed peace settlement. And then he just then called President Zelensky to inform him of what was said. That's not a negotiation. It's also not particularly helpful that Trump has talked about inviting Russia back into the G7, which was a statement he made yesterday. And it's also not helpful that he wants to go and meet Putin in Saudi Arabia to negotiate a peace deal in the absence of Ukraine. And so we're dealing with a lot of different conflicting pieces of information. It's very hard to know who we should believe, who we shouldn't believe. What's being said is policy or what they're just making up on the spot. But if I was a Ukrainian right now, I would be pretty upset. And as a sympathizer to Ukraine, I'm not very happy with the state of events.
From your perspective, what does President Trump is trying to do? Do you see this as a special technique for negotiations with Vladimir Putin?
Well, I don't see any special logic in the technique. So, for example, through his defense secretary, Pete Hegseth, he started giving away territory of Ukraine. He made a commitment not to allow Ukraine into NATO. That's not a negotiating technique. That's if you're negotiating, you don't give away your position before the negotiation starts. And so I don't know what to make of it other than it's not helpful. I think it's puts Ukraine in a weaker position than it was before, and it's hard to know what's going to happen.
It's also interesting that today we have heard another statement from the Pete Hegseth, U.S. Secretary of Defense. He said that the U.S. could return nuclear weapons to Ukraine if Donald Trump decides to do so. Do you see this as an attempt from Trump's team to raise stakes and also to improve their own position after the recent yesterday's statement about Putin and NATO Ukraine?
It's hard for me to imagine this as a strategy. I imagine this is a reaction to the extremely negative reaction of all of America's allies to these confusing statements that were made over the last couple of days. I think that it's very difficult to read anything into what's happening because it just changes so radically from day to day. But when the future existence of your country is at stake, that must be very upsetting.
Also, I would like to cover the readiness of Russian dictator Putin to negotiate with Trump. Recently, you said that Vladimir Putin is a psychopath and it's impossible to negotiate with him. From your perspective, is it possible to force psychopaths Vladimir Putin to agree to a ceasefire?
Well, what I know that Putin likes to do is to make agreements that he then doesn't honor. He's been around for 25 years now. There's no mystery to Vladimir Putin. What does he do? He agrees to things, he lies in negotiations, and then he doesn't honor his commitments. And so I don't think that any promise from him serves any purpose whatsoever. It's very much a empty promise. He lies and he deceives and he goes against his commitments, and so there's no reason to believe he would be any different in the future than he was in the past.
But do you feel that Vladimir Putin can agree with this recent proposal on a ceasefire, for example, for at least some time to have a ceasefire in Ukraine?
Well, I think that he would agree to a ceasefire if the conditions put him in a position to subsequently break the ceasefire and carry on with his war. I mean, Putin is tired. Ukrainians are exhausted. Putin is tired. He's expended huge amounts of resources, people, money, equipment, and I think he probably wouldn't mind a short break to build up his resources again.
So you're confident that if there is a ceasefire, Vladimir Putin could agree with this deal just to regroup and attack Ukraine again in the future?
I think he's only going to agree to some deal if he gets a really good deal. And I think that he's also very much a man who likes to create a confusing process where it's hard to respond to what he's saying. And so it looks like there's a negotiation going on, but there isn't really a negotiation.
So you don't expect Vladimir Putin to make any kind of concessions to Ukraine and the United States?
No, absolutely not.
He will not do this because that's how he behaves.
Putin is a guy who doesn't negotiate. He doesn't compromise. He only pushes hard. And he doesn't mind exposing his own people to pain because he's not a democratically elected leader. He's a dictator. And so it doesn't matter to him. His credibility doesn't matter to him. Nothing really matters to him other than basically being the strong man and being seen to be strong.
Also, according to Bloomberg, Vladimir Putin is forming his special team for negotiations with the American administration. From your perspective, do you feel that this team could play any kind of a role in the decision-making process in Kremlin, or only Vladimir Putin is the guy who makes all the decisions?
No, he doesn't delegate to anybody. He's a decision maker in all decisions. So whoever he's sending out will, basically just figure out what's on the table and then report back to him, and then he can play around and see if there's any area where he can negotiate.
Trump it seems like he's really confident that sanctions, tariffs, and decrease of global oil prices could really force Putin to negotiate a ceasefire. How harmful could be for Russia's economy such decisions if such decisions would be implemented by U.S. president?
Well, if the sanctions, tariffs, taxes, etc., were to seriously dent the oil revenue, then it could have an impact.
Do you feel that Trump has ability to make a decrease in oil prices worldwide around the globe?
No, not in the short term. In the medium term, policy can change oil prices. In the short term, I don't think that's the case. But he can also be effective in, cutting off Russia's ability to export their oil, either through through sanctions on shipping companies and sanctions on ports and other types of things like that.
But it would take a time to decrease global oil prices.
I think so. Yeah, absolutely.
And how many time it could take from your years, months, or if there is a
years. I mean, it's a very long process to increase. Now, the oil price could change on its own very drastically if there's a recession or China has a economic problem of some significance. These are the types of things that could push the oil price in the short term. But otherwise, you need to invest in an oil well, and then that oil well needs to start pumping, and then you need to start exporting that oil, and that has to add on to all the other oil, and then the price of the oil goes down.
Also, Ukrainian President William Zelensky also says that Vladimir Putin is only pretending that he would like to have a deal, but he just tell Trump what he would like to hear. Do you agree with President Zelensky with this assessment?
Well, I think that it's slightly different than that. I think that Putin needs to have the war in place in order to stay in power. He needs to look like the strong man. And he's very upset with the losses that he's experienced and the humiliating way in which his soldiers have conducted themselves on the battlefield. But at the same time, he's not the one experiencing the pain. It's his people, and he's not in a democratic country where you can get, it's not like there's a voter electorate that will kick you out. He's very much in a position where he can experience really extreme pain for a long time without any problem.
So he just continues his war because he does not suffer himself.
Correct. And any other head of state couldn't have even achieved, or I should say, experienced 1/100th of the losses that he's experienced. In a normal situation, the people would get upset in the country, and that would be the end of that. But in Putin, there's no people to get upset.
But how Western allies and Ukraine together can inflict pain directly on Vladimir Putin? You mean like physically or other means?
Well, I think the main thing to do is to continue to wear the Russian military out, to destroy the oil refineries, as they've been doing, to get more sanctions in place, to go after the oil, to sanction the oil companies, sanction the buyers of the Russian oil, that type of thing.
What is your take on security guarantees for Ukraine? Lots of discussions about the European peacekeeping forces could be deployed to the front lines. Can you imagine such scenario?
It's completely unimaginable. I mean, I can imagine them putting peacekeepers in place, but what do the peacekeepers do when Russia starts attacking? Do they fight back? So if you have a bunch of international peacekeepers, are they going to fight back and engage in a war with Russia, or do they just don't do anything?
And also Pete Hegseth ruled out deploying American troops on the ground. Do you feel that without American military presence, this mission could not be credible?
Well, I mean, look, the Ukrainian military has deflected a major invasion from Russia, and Ukraine wasn't known, 3 years ago to be some kind of world power. I mean, I think that anybody with enough resources can fight off Russia. And I think that if Europe was involved, I think that Russia would have a hard time with or without America.
Let's cover also the state of Vladimir Putin's grip on power. How can you assess the current situation in the Kremlin? Reuters reported that Russian allies are not really happy about the war because of sanctions, but how can you assess the state of Putin's grip on power?
He's got a firm grip on power. I mean, people are angry, people are badly affected. It's not a good situation, but it doesn't matter what people feel like in Russia because Putin will arrest, torture, and kill anybody who stands in his way. And so it's not public opinion doesn't matter. And he's very conscious of any attempted coups or anything like that because he's looking out for, disloyalty.